Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome very much to the first of a series of talks that the Buckinghamshire Military Museum Trust is hosting this year. The first one tonight and then more in the autumn on the theme of Secret Buckinghamshire, about the various secret activities in the county during the Second World War. If I can just make a few housekeeping announcements, I think you are all going to be automatically muted until towards the end. There is the ability to ask questions on the chat system, I think. And because we're expecting over 500 participants this evening, I will probably try and group some of those questions at the end. It's pretty appropriate, I think, to begin with Bletchley Park. It's extraordinary, really, to believe that there were 10,000 employees, both there and at its outstations during the war, and yet that secret was kept. And it was only in 1974, with the publication of Winterbottom's The Ultra Secret, that really this came into the public domain. The site itself, of course, opened to the public in 1993. And an awful lot has been written about Bletchley Park since then. It's featured in television and film and indeed fiction, although I guess that the fiction encompasses some of what purports to be facts about Bletchley Park. And as our speaker this evening has written, there is a particular popular image of Bletchley, which is eccentrics overcoming the odds, the enemy in the establishment, and above all, valiant Turing, a mind martyred by his country. John Ferris is Professor of History at the University of Calgary, and he's really uniquely qualified to talk about Bletchley Park this evening. He's internationally known for his work on the history of British intelligence services and for some pioneering work in the technical aspects of signals intelligence. John was educated at the University of Alberta and then at King's College London, from which he received his doctorate. And his many publications include The Evolution of British Strategic Policy, 1919 to 26, and the British Army and Signals Intelligence during the First World War. In 2017, John was selected to write the first authorized history of GCHQ, and that was published by Bloomsbury in October of 2020, Behind the Enigma, the Authorized History of GCHQ, Britain's secret cyber intelligence agency. And it was very widely and favorably reviewed, and it was characterized as a warts and all history. And I should add that the modestly priced paperback version is going to come out in June and will be available from all good bookshops and from a certain online retailer. So without further ado, I'd like you all now to welcome John Ferris to talk on Bletchley Park, British intelligence, and the Second World War.
Thank you, Ian. I'm glad to be talking to you today. I've been working in the history of British signals intelligence since about 1982. And it's been a very long, strange trip in the sense that when I started out, the material was very fragmentary. But increasingly, it became available. And then when I did the authorized history, I was given a fair amount of access to material on GCHQ from 1945 to actually the present day. Now, what I'm going to do is focus on Bletchley itself, both as an organization, as part of the evolution of British signals intelligence, and also as a factor in British power and success during the Second World War. And let me say from the start that, in fact, I've gone through many organizations in my time. And I would say that I've never run across one which impresses me for its intellectual caliber, problem-solving ability, etc. As I would say about Bletchley Park. It's the high point of the history of British signals intelligence and intelligence generally. Now, British signals intelligence begins in 1914, and that's true of any major Western state. It didn't exist in 1913. In other words, there wasn't an integration of the components of signals intelligence, like interception capabilities, cryptanalysis, or traffic analysis until the First World War begins. Britain has a very good SIGINT war in the First World War. And afterward, it creates a small but very good permanent SIGINT agency, which combines interception by radio, primarily handled by the services, but also by British or Canadian and Australian navies, with a cryptanalytical organization in London called the Government Code and Cipher School. It focuses essentially on diplomatic codes. Its primary task is to break diplomatic traffic. It does have radio intercept and to some degree code-breaking capabilities against military organizations, which becomes significant in the 1930s. But there are two big gaps in its coverage as we hit the early 1930s, one of which is complete inability to penetrate Soviet codes, although toward the end of the 30s that changes. But even more significantly, a failure to break into German cryptographic developments. And the reason there's no focus on German cryptographic developments is that nobody cares. It's not a high area of policy for the British state, and therefore not a high area of policy for Government Code and Cipher School. Whereas for the Poles, it's the number one issue. And that's why the Poles go after Enigma in the correct way, and why it is in 1939 they can offer gifts to Britain, which allow Britain to make up for what it hadn't acquired over the previous decade. But in, let's say, 1930, the British are reading the diplomatic traffic of almost every other state they interact with at a high level, including the Soviets in Asia. They've got good military level intercept capability, and then the Depression hits. And it's from this moment onward that GC&CS begins to take the steps that lead toward Bletchley. And indeed, in some ways, GC&CS is actually the first of British military organizations to start rearmament, a topic that Ian and I have both had to deal with in our academic careers, in the sense that the man who runs GC&CS ultimately, who's Admiral Sinclair, the chief of the Secret Service, essentially delivers a kind of ultimatum to the military services in 1931 saying, look, at the moment we have an organization that is good, that is underfinanced. Essentially, if we're going to get anywhere, we have to spend more money. And if you're not willing to spend more money, maybe we should think about canceling the whole thing. And what he's able to do is to convince the services in particular to increase their investments in radio intercept personnel and kit, and help to move GC&CS toward a situation where it can actually handle the problems which will emerge in the Second World War. And I'd say that in the 1930s, when you go through the files, Sinclair has a very clear vision of what GC&CS needs to do in case there's another war. And he's moving it in that direction. It's also aided by Alistair Denniston, who's the director of GC&CS, and other leading members of the organization. Now, Sinclair is a radio fanatic. He really believes that radio is a very significant issue. And when he starts to think about the prospect of war, that governs a lot of the decisions he makes. And although it's not commonly known, the decisions about the strategic use of radio, both for communication and intercept, by the British military services and intelligence services in the 1930s are among the best any government in the world handles. But it also helps to shape what it is that Sinclair does when he begins to say, if there's a war, what are we going to do with GC&CS? What Sinclair essentially says is we can't stay in London because of the danger of bombing. Ideally, we would put GC&CS in a locale where there are radio, military radio stations in large number, and where there's room to expand. And it would be nice if we could find a locale for them. And I think one of the reasons why Buckinghamshire becomes so important in British intelligence in the war is that all of this coincides with a moment when country houses are extremely cheap to purchase. And when British government agencies, especially intelligence ones, are thinking about expansion physically and getting out of London, Buckinghamshire actually is a reasonably cheap place to move to. And ultimately, Sinclair decides to try to centralize both SIS and GC&CS in Bletchley Park because it's a building that's reasonably salubrious. It can easily hold several hundred people. So in other words, you could double the size of SIS and GC&CS and be able to house them there. It's close to High Wycombe, which is the center of the RAF strategic radio system, which is the core of British strategic communications in the 30s and during the Second World War. So it's relatively easy to build communications links, landlines primarily, from High Wycombe to Bletchley Park. And beyond that, there's lots of open spaces where you can build lots and lots of radio stations. So that's the reason why Bletchley is selected. The dilemma that emerges once the war breaks out and once both SIS and GC&CS become based in Bletchley is that no one had realized how big GC&CS would have to be in order to handle its tasks. Now, there are probably about 1,000 intercept personnel in the military services, the Metropolitan Police in Britain. The GC&CS itself, when it moves to Bletchley, is maybe 130 odd people, most of whom are involved in diplomatic code breaking or clerical personnel. But as the war begins to go on, rapidly the numbers of people involved in GC&CS are just overwhelming in number. Before the war, Denniston has worked out a system of expanding these numbers, which he thinks will bring in a couple of hundred extra people. And in fact, what he's looking at is the idea of a better and improved room of 40. But what rapidly becomes clear is that the requirements to attack machine ciphers are going to force a radical change in organization and also force a radical increase in the number of people working for British code breaking. I don't want to get into a huge amount of technical discussion here, but let me put it this way. In the late 1930s, both Sinclair and Denniston are increasingly doubtful that if war breaks out, you can actually read the codes of major belligerents, and certainly not the Germans. Denniston is willing to gamble that maybe you can break in, but their fundamental assumption is probably we won't, but we will be able to justify our expense by picking up lots and lots of neutral traffic. But Denniston, during 1938, increasingly is having GC&CS focus on attacking Enigma, the German system. They're not able to break in because of some very elementary conceptual problems, but he does want to have it handled. And so Denniston makes discreet inquiries among friends in Oxford, ex-members of British SIGINT, looking for a small number of mathematicians. Now, GC&CS has some experience in applying math to code breaking, and they know what they want from mathematicians. This is actually a very important point. The profession of mathematics in the 30s is becoming increasingly professionalized, and there is a tendency for mathematicians to want to work on the theory of math. But in Britain, there is still a reasonably large priority in university mathematicians focused on the application of math, practical mathematics, physics, for example. And what Denniston ends up acquiring are a small number of mathematicians who are all focused on how you apply mathematics, practically speaking. Now, this is actually the most impressive bit of talent spotting in the history of espionage, because Denniston manages to hire two of the greatest mathematical cryptanalysts ever, in order to join GC&CS. One is Alan Turing, who in the course of his time at Bletchley Park, in effect invents computing science. And the other is Gordon Welchman, the man who really makes ultra work. Now, when this group of 4 mathematicians are brought into Bletchley in September, in essence, they're seen as a kind of gamble, but a gamble that Britain is willing to put money down on. They're given preferred opportunities in terms of rooms to work in. Denniston and his deputy, Edward Travis, offer them all the help they can. They're given the opportunity to learn traditional cryptanalysis, and in particular, they're put in contact with the Poles. Now, as you all know, in late 1939, late autumn or summer 1939, as the Anglo-French-Polish alliance emerges, the Poles finally show their cryptanalytic hand to the British and the French. They showed that through the 30s, they had in fact been reading Enigma a fair amount, but had finally been unable to overcome increasing complications in the way the Germans used the system in late 1938. The dilemma is the Poles are too broke a country to afford significant numbers of data processing machines. The problem they're up against is one in which pure mathematics no longer can give you access to the system. You need data processing machines in order to break into it. And so in the autumn of 1939, what in effect happens is that Turing and Welchman are put into contact with Poles who can outline the theory of how they'd attack Enigma. But Welchman and Turing are also part of a country which can afford to allocate enough money to buy some of the world's best and largest data processing machines in order to act on their material. Now, in the space of 2 months, Turing conceptualizes how it is you could break Enigma. And he also conceptualizes the design parameters for a data processing machine to break it. He shows this material to Welchman, who the next morning shows Turing a way to more than double the efficiency of Turing's initial approach. Immediately, they go to Edward Travis and say, this is what we've done. Immediately, quite literally in a day, Travis goes to the successor of Admiral Sinclair, who's died of a heart attack, a man named Stuart Menzies, and tells him what's going on. And Stuart Menzies immediately, this is all in like 24 hours, says, how much money will it require to build this machine? 200,000 pounds. Here's a check. Now, if you think about how Whitehall normally operates, you can see how unusual this is. Now, in turn, what happens is immediately they turn to British tabulating machines, which is the only company in the world which has allowed free access to IBM patents and also is able to modify them. The reason being that IBM machines all work on dollars and cents, and all British tabulating machines work on pound, shilling, etc. And so if you don't change the system, it can't work in the British Empire. And in fact, one of the leaders in British tabulating machines is a man named Doc Keane, who's one of the world's great designers of standard tabulating machines. And he builds a system that works. Now, on top of all of this, while the tabulating machine is being built, Welchman sits down and says, if this system works, and if it starts to break into German traffic, what kind of organization are we going to need to effectively process the material? And in effect, what Welchman sketches out is an organization which is about the same size as GC&CS was in peacetime. And he brings this diagram to Edward Travis and says, sir, if we're going to make this work, we need to have this organization in being before the machine has actually been tested. And Travis says, well, my son, create this organization. Now, what I want to emphasize is the extraordinary fluidity in decision-making here. I have never seen, not merely any British government organization, but any government organization, military or otherwise, behave so efficiently as occurs here. Let me also say the same thing happens in 1943 when Max Neumann is brought in by GCNCS to attack even more sophisticated German cipher machines, which are often called the fish systems. Travis and Neumann do exactly the same thing as had been done with Enigma in 1939-40. So in other words, what you've got is the ability to make instantaneous decisions. Just like the famous Trafalgar Day memorandum, October 1941, when the machine crypto people and Bletchley send by cab a letter to Winston Churchill himself saying, "Sir, if you want us to be able to succeed, we need to have guaranteed sources of good labor. If you don't get it for us, we will not be able to do what you want us to do." And Churchill immediately writes on it, "Give them what they want. Tell me what has been done. Action this day." So in essence, Bletchley is very lucky in the sense that it's led by people and it's supported by people at the top who are willing to give it the resources they need to attack the problems they're after. Now, the attack on those problems involves a huge amount of technical material. If you're interested in looking at it, my book talks about it in detail, but so do a lot of others. Conceptually and organizationally, it is, I'd say, one of the two most advanced and difficult scientific stroke organizational problems of the Second World War. The other being the Manhattan Project, which of course is much bigger. What is done is truly remarkable. And in effect, what is created is something no one had ever thought of before. Essentially, the world's strongest concentration of data processing machines, involving ultimately the creation, I'm willing to say, of the first computer. Because although one could get into arguments about whether Colossus is or is not a computer, I'm willing to say it's so close that it's not worth debating the issue. The allocation of enough resources, of scarce brain power and labor to enable a machine to emerge which can produce information and then process information. And here, the other point I will emphasize is that this is not all happening in a vacuum. The British are the only people doing this. Nobody else is. It's partly because there's a native British approach toward information processing, which is unique. And in the First World War, the War Trade Intelligence Department actually is processing, this is not a joke, 1 billion different pieces of cable, wireless messages, and letters, and turning this into a form which can be accessed by analysts within 2 hours of deciding you want to know everything about some obscure Norwegian manufacturer of banjos, to use an example, which in fact comes out of the official history. And that's applied to the same sorts of things that happen in Bletchley. So what happens in Bletchley is essentially a specific application of the way the British process information applied to cryptanalysis and to war. I'm happy to answer any questions on them, but I'd also say my book and many others will give you material you need. I'd also like to say that you're dealing with a social phenomenon that's really amazing. You're taking this relatively small town in Buckinghamshire and turning it into a medium-sized town, where ultimately you have to set up bus systems that move people in the middle of the night from Bletchley to the places they're staying in. The human organization you create, the difficulties in creating it are really very, very interesting. Women make up the majority of the personnel in Bletchley, most of them doing the boring clerical work. Women in SIGINT during the Second World War actually are often not doing boring work. From 1943 onward, every new person added to British wireless intercept is a woman, because you've run out of manpower. And what you are creating essentially are women-only wireless intercept personnel, who are in fact extremely good And indeed, women are regarded by the leaders of British intercept as being better than men at the task. And indeed, and this may sound truly bizarre to you, there are instances of 20-year-old British girls being sent out to these outstations manned by grizzled intercept personnel with the orders to get these men in line and teach them how to do their work. And they're able to make that happen. But the women involved in Bletchley are actually doing, it's like working in a cotton mill. It's incredibly boring. You're moving bits and pieces into one system or another in order to make the machine work. Now, what does that machine produce? Well, British SIGINT produces lots of different things in the war. And I could talk about traffic analysis, which is gathering intelligence simply from monitoring the external features of any communication system, whether it's telephone communications on the internet today or radio communications on medium to high frequencies in the Second World War. But I'm going to focus on ULTRA. Now, ULTRA is the Allied code word for material generated from high-grade cryptanalysis. That means Italian book codes or Japanese book codes. It also means Italian, Japanese, German crypto machines. Now, most crypto machines in this period are actually pretty primitive. Enigma and the American and British ones, SIGABA and TypeX, along with the Geheimschreiber systems, which the Germans later adapt, are harder to beat. Now, what you're getting from these sources is what my old friend and the pioneering SIGINT historian who also was there, Rafe Bennett, is a random selection of secrets. You're not able to intercept everything the Germans transmit, although the British Americans by the end of the war are close to that. You're not able to read everything you intercept. And my book actually cites a 2-page long memo by Welchman, which shows the ways in which the British jump from one German circuit to another, moving from a circuit they know they can break into that has traffic that's worthless, in order to get ultimately into a circuit which has a traffic you'd really like to know about. All of these things generate material that's a fluctuating value. Now, occasionally what you get is the individual message that tells you what you really want to know. So for example, perhaps the most useful single bits of communication intelligence in the war are solutions of Japanese diplomatic traffic, magic, handled by the British in Berkeley Street in London, from the Japanese military and naval attaches in Berlin during 1944, because the Japanese military and naval attaches visit the West Wall, they talk to Germans, they send back long dispatches to Tokyo, which the British intercept and read. And in fact, due to the vagaries of radio transmission, in a lot of cases, the British are the only people who can intercept this traffic and the Americans can't. But what this gives you is a very clear picture of what German perceptions are, a clear picture of what the Japanese think of the Western Wall, which goes directly to the top and is read by senior staff officers and decision makers. But much of the material you get really cannot be used without being processed in great detail. Because what you're getting are, any of you who've been in the military will know what I mean. You'll be getting messages which are housekeeping in nature, and which will talk about 20 or 30 different issues. And they'll mention the names of the second lieutenant in a signals regiment attached to a panzer division. And they'll talk about all sorts of other things. And in order to squeeze material out of this stuff, you have to actually record and analyze it. Now here the British in effect replicate what the War Trade Intelligence Department did in the First World War, although from what I can see, they didn't know anything about what the War Trade Intelligence Department had done. It's simply if you set up the same problem for two different groups of Brits 20 years apart, they approach that problem in the same way. And in effect, through an organization called HUT3, which, like the War Trade Intelligence Department, is the most academic analytical organization British intelligence ever has, and indeed, I suspect, is better than anything in the world. What you end up with is an organization of about 500 people, men and women, including lots of historians and classicists. In fact, historians, as it turns out, are extremely good at intelligence analysis. I've seen that in my own work dealing with GCHQ material and talking to SIG enters, but also from just looking at the historical record. But classicists are good as well. So what you create are these 24-hour teams, which focus on issues like German railways, or death camps, or which linked under German police. And what you're doing is indexing every single fact or noun in every different message, which means that if you're trying to track the movement of a division, maybe you can do so by looking at the name of its signals personnel. Because German divisions tend to be fairly regular in their composition, and if you can identify individual subordinate officers who are linked to a division, then their movements might tell you something about what's happening with the division. You can work out a great deal of material from this kind of approach, which is the only, unique to Britain. The Americans don't do it, nobody else does it. In fact, the Americans don't start doing this sort of thing until years after the Second World War. And when they do, they're following British models because they really respect Bletchley. The Americans think that Bletchley leaves them in the dust. When American SIGINT officers go to Bletchley or to Berkeley Street, which is the diplomatic SIGINT organization, they write back messages saying, two elderly British SIGINTers can do the work that we assign 20 bright young Harvard undergraduates to handle. They're really extremely impressed by Bletchley. And I will say here that Bletchley really is organized according to Welshman's model. Turing is the man who shows you how to do it and inspires a lot of the technicalities of cryptanalysis, but Welshman is the organizer. Okay, so you end up with all of this material. How does it matter? Now, this is where some of what I write in the book challenges what a lot of Brits like to say. And it comes from the fact that I'm a trained military historian. I think at the moment I really would say I'm primarily a signals intelligence historian, but I started out as a military historian. And that means I have ideas about how intelligence works, judging from military history. And my own experience in military history is that intelligence is never, and I repeat, never, a fundamental source of power. Fundamental sources of power are the quality of command. Fundamental sources of power are your ability to generate effective armed forces. Intelligence is a wild card when you get to this process. You can have really good intelligence that doesn't get you anywhere because you can't act on it. And the term action on, which is what SIGINTers mean when they're talking about any use of their material, or the term actionable, which military forces talk about, essentially means, can I do something with it? Sometimes you're a first-rate intelligence agency and your product is limited because your enemy is first-rate, which is true of the Battle of the Atlantic. We tend to forget just how good German SIGINT was in the Battle of the Atlantic. B-Dienst is, as long as there's a German Navy that can act on intelligence, B-Dienst is as good as Ultra is when it comes to the Battle of the Atlantic. And what that means is that two first-rate intelligence agencies are limiting what the other one can do. Now, beyond that, you can have good intelligence delivered to commanders who just can't make it work. And that, by the way, is the history of the Western Desert in 1941, 1942, until you get to Montgomery. I'm not a wild fan of Montgomery, but I will say he's a competent commander who knows how to use intelligence well, and also has a really weird ability to predict what the enemy is going to do. But prior British commanders loved intelligence, tried to act on it, but they weren't able to train their forces to fight effectively against the African Corps. And I will admit that they don't have adequate anti-tank weaponry, which Montgomery does have once he is taking on Rome. So in that context, in order for intelligence to be useful, it has to systematically, across the board, be better than the enemy and to give you material you can act on. Now, what that means in my analysis is that ultra is irrelevant to Britain's survival in the war. It just doesn't matter enough until you are going to survive. Once the United States and the Soviets are in the war, it is hard to see the enemy winning. And it's only around that time that ultra is really consistently providing actionable intelligence. Before that, it provides good intelligence, but the Germans and the Italians are getting good intelligence too. So there's a trade-off. Now, where does ultra really matter to the Allies in the war? Well, it does matter at sea. The dilemma being how stretched out the Royal Navy is, and the fact that for much of the war at sea in Europe, the enemy has as good intelligence as Britain does. I would say that if you look at almost any naval engagement in European waters, and I include here the entire Battle of the Atlantic, you'll find there's an intelligence background. And I would say that systematically from early 1943 onward, that intelligence background is working in Britain's favor finally. No longer does German SIGINT really matter. So if you're going to say to me, does SIGINT really affect the late spring, early summer defeat of the U-boats? I'd say yes, indeed it does. Although, so too does the application of centimetric radar to British warships, the allocation of about 80 aircraft that can now cover the gap in the Atlantic Ocean, the fact that you've now got air cover that can cover all of the Atlantic. Those things matter just as much. But ultra, yeah, it does turn the tide there. But the end result in some ways is that unfortunately, we don't win an ultra until the Royal Navy has effectively won the war by knocking out the Italian and German navies without an intelligence advantage. Oddly enough, it does better without an intelligence advantage than Britain had done with the Navy in the First World War with an intelligence advantage. But if you like, I'm happy to talk about that later. It doesn't help in the combined bombing offensive because German aerial SIGINT is good, and because there's a systematic tendency in strategic air defense for good intelligence to help the defender against the attacker. Britain shows this in the Battle of Britain, when the combination of radar and SIGINT really gives Britain, the Royal Air Force, a systematic advantage over the Germans, which Fighter Command is able to use well. Unfortunately, the same thing happens in the combined bombing offensive. It's not until the Americans, in effect, in the spring of '44, bring fighters with them over the skies of Germany and blow the Luftwaffe apart, that finally the combined bombing offensive can work without the horrific losses of 1942-43. And if you bear in mind how important the combined bombing campaign is to the British and American war economies, this actually means that in a really important part of the war, German SIGINT actually beats us. It lets the Germans do better than we can do, even though our SIGINT in the skies is extremely good. It's just that good intelligence helps the defender more there than it does the attacker. Ultra is not great, unfortunately, from our perspective, for most of the land battles against the Germans, 43, 44, 45, because there are too many Germans, the front is too small, force-to-space ratios are too high. In my experience, if you're looking for intelligence to help you in operations, it's good to have open-ended flanks. And once you're ashore, unfortunately, all of us are up against thick German defensive positions which have so much firepower, we can't avoid having to smash the firepower in order to get through. Okay, so what does that leave Ultra to do? Well, it really leaves two important areas. The first of those is the strategic level, which in effect means, how do we pick which portions of Europe to invade? How do we know what the force levels we need to win? And how do we prevent the Germans from piling so many forces into those places that we can't break through? If the bear in mind what happens at Anzio and Salerno. The Germans throw enough reserves into an invasion zone that they swamp it and prevent any further movement forward until essentially other Allied forces come up from behind and force the Germans to withdraw. The same thing could have happened at Normandy. The Germans are in the middle of reinforcing Normandy, which is their number 2 guess as to where the Allies would invade, to such a level that if we hadn't invaded on the 6th of June, we might not have been able to invade at all. All you need to do is throw another 3 or 4 decent German divisions into Normandy, and a breakthrough or the establishment of an acceptable beachhead is not going to be easy. Now, at this strategic level, the British leave the Germans gasping. I say Brits because the Americans really leave the intelligence side of the European war to the British. The Americans do provide very good means to break into U-boat traffic, which they're also willing to loan to Welchman in order to conduct his daily campaign against German traffic. But essentially, intelligence in Europe is a British game. The Germans are in a disastrous position in strategic intelligence for the following reasons. They don't build up effective espionage networks in Britain, the United States, or the Soviet Union before the war. Now, nobody does in the Soviet Union, but the Germans failed to do it before the war. Then when the war breaks out, the Germans simply start throwing untrained agents against the wall, like spaghetti, hoping that some of them will stick. And unfortunately, in every one of the 3 cases of the Soviets, British, and Americans, local security rounds these guys up. So agents are out for a German intelligence source, but they do become a British deception source. German aerial reconnaissance and photography is simply dead on the water from 1941 onward. So they can't get the aerial imagery that's a key source for the British and Americans, and they can't process it. They don't have strategic level SIGINT against the British or Americans. They do for a while against the Germans, and in fact, the evidence is pretty clear that in the first year of the Eastern Front, the Germans have a SIGINT superiority over the Russians that is like Ultra at its best. But it's not from breaking into Soviet systems, it's from overrunning Soviet headquarters. They overrun so many Soviet headquarters so often that they're constantly able to capture and read the new cryptographic kit that's just been disseminated a couple of days before. So the Germans are really blind in strategic intelligence. The British are not. They're able to see where the Germans are deploying forces. They have a pretty clear picture of the movement of reinforcements in and out. Now, the picture that they produce is not often that nice. If you go through the planning for Normandy, which I've done, it's not a nice thing to be preparing for. It's really a matter of saying, what is the least bad choice before us? But British planners are able to come up with good options. And I would say that what they do with Torch, what they do with Sicily, Italy, Normandy are all good to outstanding selections. They know what the Germans are capable of doing, basically. They deploy the force levels they need to do. They succeed across the board. And the Germans are caught by surprise on every occasion. Now, if you bear in mind that military historians view amphibious assaults as being the most complicated and difficult form of the military art, the fact that it looks so easy in the Second World War stems largely from intelligence, good decisions, well processed. The other thing Ultra does is enable British deception. Now, deception has been practiced by every army historically. It's now becoming clear that it's simply a normal way by which military forces work in history. But I don't think there's ever been a case where deception was handled as well as it is by the British in the Second World War. Partly through fluke, junior intelligence officers in Britain discovered that you can actually do things like inflate the alleged number of divisions the British have by 200%, and the Germans and Italians will believe it. So in other words, you can actually get the enemy to do its planning on the basis of the idea that the British and American armies and Canadian armies are twice as strong as they actually are. That's because none of us do what the Germans do. The Germans simply build many more divisions per million people than we do. And so the Germans expect that we will do what they do, and therefore believe that we'll have more divisions than we do. And junior officers also find that you can actually use deception effectively to outmaneuver the enemy. And British commanders love to do it. They're good at it, including Montgomery, who's often regarded as being extremely conservative. Now, Bletchley itself actually discovers what these junior officers are doing because it's not connected with them, and it says, wow, these people can use our product. And so Bletchley begins immediately to provide specially selected material to the deception personnel to let them know what the Germans think is happening, to aid the planning for deception, et cetera, et cetera. But what I would say in a simple fashion is this. British deception is extremely good in the war. From El Alamein onward, the Germans are caught badly by surprise. Do you think it's an accident that Rommel is back home in Germany visiting his wife on the night before El Alamein and the night before the invasion of D-Day? It's not an accident. And I would say that really it's hard to imagine the West being as successful against the Germans in these forms of art, which really go a long way to knocking the Germans out without deception. So at the strategic level, Ultra really enables extremely effective use of British and American resources against the Germans. It happens at the moment when attrition has ground the Germans down. But it also means that in the last 2.5 years of the war, our record against the Germans is pretty bloody good. We kill and capture far more of them than we lose. And the question at the end of the war is, how does Ultra matter? Well, I don't know. Nobody knows. Intelligent people have said that they think that Ultra enables the war to end 2 years faster than it would have done. I doubt that. I would say the people who argue that are forgetting about the fact that the Red Army is ripping the Germans apart. And they overestimate the significance of the Battle of the Atlantic. But, you know, if I were to look at what Eisenhower says at the end of the war in the letter he writes to Edward Travis and GC&CS, he says countless thousands of Allied soldiers are alive because of you. And I think that's a fair guess. I'd be willing to say we're talking about intelligence shaving several months and tens or maybe hundreds of thousands of potential losses from our side, and making the end of the war much more successful from our point of view than it might have been otherwise. But at the same time, I also have to tell you, this all works because Britain is a powerful country with a very large military industrial complex, with good leadership once you get into the war, able to make competent decisions across the board. There is no country on earth which makes better strategic decisions than Britain does. And in that sense, Ultra really matters as much as it does because it reinforces an already high level of British strength. in terms of its strategic decision-making. But nonetheless, I would not say that Ultra wins the war, which is what a lot of people often say. And I would say that it's simply the most spectacular instance of British originality in the war. Nobody else comes close to you in what is done with SIGINT. And it is perhaps the highest case of intelligence mattering in war that I'm aware of. I could get down to more minor issues like Confrontazi in the 1960s, where it really does help the British. With the Falklands War, which I would say SIGINT matters as much as it does in the Second World War. But really, I can't think of any example where where intelligence has mattered more to victory in a war than Ultra does in the Second World War. And all of that now is linked to this mansion and museum in Buckinghamshire, which is a pleasant place to visit. So, thank you very much. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to try to answer.
Okay, well, thank you, John. There have been a number of questions that have come in, which I will sort of go through, if I may. Some others may come in subsequently. First one really is, what was the relationship of Bletchley Park to Hughenden?
Not sure that I can really answer that. They're providing material to different components of the British strategic decision-making system.
Okay. And the second one was, how important was Tommy Flowers?
If I didn't get around to talking about the development of Colossus or the way in which the British go about attacking the fish systems. But essentially, when you look at what happens in 1943, 44, 45, you're dealing with different kinds of techniques that are going to have to be used if you're using data processing machines to attack cryptographic machines. Essentially, what happens in the case of 1943-44 is you're moving toward electronic switches. You're moving away from an electromechanical system to one which is really dealing with much more with electronics. And so people like Doc Keane actually don't have the technical experience you need in order to make these machines work. And Tommy Flowers, who comes from a GPO background, meaning that he's been dealing with civilian telephone kit for all of his life, actually has experience that is relevant. Now, in those days, valves or vacuum tubes have a really mixed reputation among users and designers. They're seen as being very fragile, they break very easily. And what Flowers is doing ultimately is talking about building a machine that's going to use 2,500 vacuum tubes. Now, from our point of view, of course, we think, who cares? But in that period, nobody believes you can actually make a system like that work. And the key here is that a relationship between Max Newman, Edward Travis, and Tommy Flowers. Now, Max Newman, aided by lots of other people, especially a young mathematician named Bill Tutt, following through from an original crypto breakthrough by Colonel John Tiltman, have managed to reconstruct the internal workings of some German crypto machines without ever seeing them. And they work out the logic behind these machines and how you were going to have to go after them. By the way, the Americans did the same thing when they broke into the Japanese diplomatic machine, which they called Purple. They never saw it. They simply were able to reconstruct the logic of the system. And so what Max Newman calculates from this is that in order to break into these machines, he's going to need far greater calculating power than anyone else has ever been able to generate. Tommy Flowers is in a competition with other people to try to come up with a means to break into it. And important people like Gordon Welchman actually think that what Flowers is doing is nuts and can't be achieved. And in fact, Welchman tries to have Tommy Flowers' work shut down. But Flowers works for the GPO, which means that he can use their research facilities at Dulles Hill to pursue his own objectives. And Max Newman is desperate in the sense that in order to break into these German systems, he needs to have a much more powerful machine than anyone else will have. And so he supports Tommy Flowers all the way. He convinces Travis to allow this to be done. And so even though there is an absolute split down the middle among the British experts in the field, Flowers is able to make his system work. And Flowers' system, which emerges in the form of Colossus, ultimately, is in effect the basis of a computer. It doesn't have memory. And so that's the reason why technical people often argue that Colossus wasn't a computer. But the first instance in which there is a memory in a computer is the Manchester Baby in 1948. And if you look at the memory in the Manchester Baby, all you're doing is running an electronic signal through a pool of mercury. That signal remains in existence for several nanoseconds.